It's stamped on lunchboxes. It's baked into wedding speeches and recruitment posters. There's a phrase for it, as American as apple pie, repeated so often that almost nobody stops to ask an uncomfortable question. The apple isn't American. The pie isn't American. Both existed for over 1,000 years before a single fork ever touched a crust in the New World. So here's the question worth asking. If nothing about apple pie actually started in America, why does an entire country still believe it did? And who benefited from that belief? This is the story of a dessert carried across continents, reshaped by war, and finally sold back to ordinary people as a symbol of a home most of them never actually had. We'll follow it from the wild orchards of Central Asia through a Roman kitchen into an English pastry shop where sugar was a luxury few could afford, across the Atlantic in a barrel destined for cider, not dessert, and into a 20th century advertising campaign that turned a fruit pie into a national identity. Along the way, we'll meet the one real person at the center of this story, a barefoot missionary and businessman named John Chapman, who most people know by a very different name. Start with the apple. It comes from somewhere no U.S. classroom ever mentions, the wild mountain forests near Almaty, Kazakhstan, a city whose name literally translates to Father of Apples. Traders moving along the Silk Road carried that fruit west, and over generations, farmers used grafting, cutting a branch from a good tree and fusing it onto new roots to lock in the sweetest varieties. Here's the strange part. Apples don't grow true from seed. Plant the seed from your favorite apple today, and the tree that grows almost certainly won't produce anything like it. Every good apple variety in existence had to be physically copied, branch by branch, tree by tree, for thousands of years. That grafting knowledge reached the Greeks, then the Romans, and Roman cooks were already doing something surprising with it. The Roman cookbook attributed to Apicius describes food sealed inside pastry shells and baked, long before medieval England became famous for pies. But here's the joke hiding in that fact. The pastry usually wasn't meant to be eaten. It was a container. Cooks called it a coffin, built to survive the oven, not to taste good. Imagine inventing Tupperware, except sometimes you're supposed to eat it. Medieval diners usually didn't. By the 1300s in England, that container had started to become part of the meal. The oldest known written apple pie recipe from a 14th century English manuscript layers figs, raisins, pears, and apples inside a pastry crust colored with saffron, but there's no sugar in it. Sugar was an imported luxury, expensive enough that most families sweetened fruit with honey or didn't sweeten it at all. That made pie a quiet marker of class. A wealthy household's pie was loaded with imported cinnamon, cloves, and sugar. A poor family's pie stretched a handful of apples with whatever else was in the pantry. Same fruit, same crust, two completely different stories depending on whose oven it came from. Then the apple crossed an ocean it wasn't built for. Here's where the real story gets interesting. Colonists planted apple seeds across North America in the 1600s, but because apples don't grow true from seed, nearly all of those trees produced fruit too sour or bitter to eat raw. So colonists didn't grow apples mainly to eat them, they grew them to drink them. Fermented apple cider was often safer than the water available on the frontier, and weaker versions were often given even to children in place of untreated water. This is where we meet our human character. John Chapman, the real man behind Johnny Appleseed, wasn't wandering the frontier planting trees so pioneer children could have pie. He was a genuine missionary who cared deeply about his faith and about the land. He was also a sharp businessman who ran nurseries of seedling trees because sour apple cider apples were exactly what frontier settlers needed, and because some land grant laws required planted orchards to prove a land claim. Both things were true about him at once. The wholesome folk hero taught in schools was really a man living at the intersection of devotion and enterprise. Sweet, pie-worthy apples only became widely available in America once grafting, that same Roman-era trick, was deliberately used to multiply specific sweet varieties instead of leaving it to chance. For most of its history, apple pie wasn't a celebration food, it was a preservation strategy. Apples kept through winter better than almost any other fruit, and pie was one of the most efficient ways to use fruit that was starting to soften. Colonial households sometimes baked pies in bulk and froze them outdoors in barrels, thawing and reheating them through the winter. Pie, for most of its life, was closer to bread than dessert, routine, practical, unglamorous. Then, the 20th century rebuilt its meaning from scratch. During the Second World War, newspapers frequently quoted American soldiers saying they were fighting for mom and apple pie. Historians debate exactly how common that sentiment really was, but the phrase caught on and stuck, fusing a fruit dessert to patriotism and home in the public imagination. Advertisers didn't invent that emotional connection, but they seized it completely. Through the 1950s, companies selling instant pie filling and pre-made crusts leaned hard into as American as apple pie, selling an idealized image of domestic life: one mother, one oven, one nuclear family. Worth noticing what that image quietly left out: immigrant communities, the enslaved and immigrant cooks who shaped American baking traditions more broadly, and regional food cultures that had nothing to do with apple pie at all. The real battle here isn't rich versus poor or old versus new. It's authenticity versus branding, a centuries-old, well-traveled dish repackaged at a very specific moment as proof of a purity it never actually had. A few details are almost too strange to be real, and every one is documented. First, as American as apple pie doesn't even start as praise. Some of its earliest recorded uses from the early 1900s appear in essays criticizing American culture as bland, the exact opposite of the patriotic meaning the phrase carries today. It was reclaimed later, the same way the pie was borrowed and rebranded. Second, apple pie recipes were in print in England and the Netherlands more than 2 centuries before the United States existed as a country. Third, American soldiers really did use familiar cultural references, baseball trivia, slang, and yes, food like apple pie as informal ways to check that a fellow soldier in the dark wasn't an infiltrator who'd studied English, but not American small talk. It wasn't a formal password system, but it was a real low-stakes habit that shows up in wartime accounts. Fourth, the crust, the part most people assume is the whole point, was for centuries sometimes not even eaten. Early pie crusts were often deliberately thick and tough, meant purely to survive the oven. The flaky, buttery crust we obsess over today is a relatively modern culinary achievement. Fifth, despite the branding, the U.S. has never actually led the world in apple consumption per person. Several European countries have historically eaten more apples per capita. The pie's American identity was never really about quantity, it was about story. Here's the twist this whole story has been building toward. Apple pie wasn't stolen from one culture by another in a single dramatic act. It was assembled from pieces over centuries by whoever needed a good story more than they needed the whole truth. Central Asian orchards gave the fruit, Roman bakers gave the pastry shell, English cooks gave the written recipe and the idea of sweetening it. Colonial farmers, chasing cider and land claims, not dessert, gave the sour seedling apples that later had to be rebred into something sweet. American baking traditions more broadly were also shaped by enslaved and immigrant cooks whose contributions rarely made it into the official story. And in the 20th century, advertisers and wartime sentiment took all of that borrowed, layered history and flattened it into one clean image: a mother, an oven, a nation. The honest version isn't that apple pie is fake, it's that as American as apple pie was never really describing something native at all. It's describing something else entirely, a talent for taking something old, foreign, and complicated and selling it back to the world as something simple and homegrown. That's not a criticism of the pie. The pie is innocent. It's a story about who gets to write history and who quietly disappears from the recipe once the marketing takes over. So next time someone hands you a slice of apple pie and calls it the most American thing they know, you'll know the fuller version: a Kazakh forest, a Roman pastry shell, an English sugar tax, a cider-obsessed missionary businessman, and a 20th century ad campaign, all baked into the same crust. That's the pattern hiding behind almost every traditional food we think we understand. If you want to keep uncovering the real history behind the food you already know, subscribe to Dish Diaries. The next episode goes even further back than this one did.